Far Cry is a franchise I used to be really into around the time of Far Cry 2 and 3. Then Far Cry 4 came out and it seemed kinda low effort to me, retreading a lot of the same ground as Far Cry 3. And then Far Cry Primal just seemed like Far Cry 4 was some kinda silly prehistoric setting. But I have been keeping my eye on the franchise in case it started to look interesting again. And that's exactly what Far Cry 5 seems to do. Which is to say, look good in the trailers, but does it really translate into the actual game? One of the first things you'll notice about the game is how smooth and satisfying the combat feels. Everything from the animations to the sounds of the guns and the bullet impacts, the kinds of gadgets you have access to, and the types of takedowns you can perform both in combat and from stealth, all lend themselves to a gameplay experience that's just fun to play with in your hands. And I honestly find it to be the biggest improvement on the Far Cry franchise, with second place in that regard going to the new vehicles they have added. In the past we've been limited to mostly ground vehicles with some gliders and boats, and one little single-seat mini helicopter in Far Cry 4. But now the vehicular arsenal has been expanded a great deal, with airplanes, seaplanes, helicopters, and I mean actual helicopters this time, not just single-seat mini choppers, with varieties ranging from regular civilian versions of these vehicles to the much more expensive weaponized versions with machine guns and missiles and all that good shit. The only flaw I'd say this presents is that it can kinda trivialize some situations, but ultimately what you want to worry about when making a game like this is whether or not it's fun. And the addition of these vehicles adds a lot of fun to the sandbox, especially in co-op modes, which is a change not only made to the campaign where you can now do co-op through the entire game, story and all, but also one made to the game's map editor, which has been a staple ever since Far Cry 2. Now dubbed the Far Cry Arcade, the arcade lets you create maps for not only multiplayer versus modes, but also solo and cooperative game modes against AI enemies beyond stuff like just bot matches, even allowing people to go so far as to create their own little mini campaigns. This is a feature that already improves the base game on its own, but will also only serve to make the game better as time goes on. Not just with more and more creative user-made maps, but also as they continue to patch the game and add more assets to the map editor. With the plans for DLC they have announced, like a zombies mode and a mode where you go to Mars and fight Martian aliens, there is a ton of potential for stuff like that to improve the map editor as well. And while I have this piece of footage up in the first place, I have to mention at least briefly how much fun the grappling hook is in this game. Whether you're using it to climb cliffs and rappel up walls, swing across chasms like Indiana Jones, or grapple onto a friend's helicopter in co-op mode like an improvised skyhook, anytime I see an opportunity to use the grappling hook I get excited just because of how much fun it is. And next, for the first time ever in the Far Cry franchise, they finally let you create your own character. Now admittedly, the character creator is a little bare bones, really only allowing you to change your gender, face, skin tone, and hairstyles, and the majority of the customization options coming from your clothing options. But with the game taking place almost entirely in first person, that's really not much of an issue, since the clothing's really the most you're gonna see yourself. And the last new addition that comes to mind is the new followers system. This system allows you to recruit 9 different main followers, as well as up to 3 minor followers, which can be any minor NPC you find out on the street, with the main followers having special traits that can serve you in combat or stealth, or just being goddamn adorable like my favorite, the Bear Cheeseburger, who simply serves as a giant lumbering powerhouse in combat. Or another option is the airfield owner, who has his own weaponized seaplane which he'll use to provide air support. And lastly, they've just on the whole built a really nice, detailed, real feeling world, filled with all kinds of little stashes and just little areas that sort of incentivize exploration. The special little Doomsday Prepper caches, for example, being some of my favorite scripted content in the game. While the satisfying combat is one of the first positives you'll notice about the game, one of the first negatives you'll notice is the horrifying ski ramp this game has for a difficulty curve. I found it to be almost unplayable on the hardest difficulty right off the bat, and even after I turned the difficulty down all the way, I still found myself getting overwhelmed a lot by the numerous patrols going around at the beginning of the game. And this just continued for the first portion of the game until I liberated more outposts, removing some of the patrols, spent more perk points getting more weapon slots and health bar upgrades, after which the difficulty sort of really dropped down to be almost too easy, so I ended up cranking the difficulty back up to hard. And after that, and after unlocking about half the skills in the game, only then did it really start to balance out. Next, the game has a bit of a problem with overlap between side quests and main quests. A lot of the time the missions are all well and good, the main quests can be really fun and exciting, and even a large majority of the side missions are a lot of fun. But every once in a while, the game throws some of these main quests at you that want you to go out and capture or destroy a certain number of side objectives. And every single time, it wants you to collect these objectives, and they are completely randomly spawned throughout the map. So you have to fly around on a helicopter for hours trying to find this one objective you need, or sometimes even 10 objectives. Randomly spawned, by the way, and not exactly common. And if it gets away, or you're trying to capture it and you blow it up on accident, you're getting your ass back in that helicopter and flying around for hours and hours again, trying to find another side objective so that you can complete your main mission. It is the most nonsensical mission design I have ever seen. It's just plain stupid is the best way I can describe it. But I can't let this weigh too heavily against the game since it's only really 3 or 4 missions in the entire game that do this. But it's incredibly frustrating when it does show up, so it's definitely affecting the score of the game. And on the subject of missions, we have the game's story. After Far Cry 2's awesome Heart of Darkness style story, and Far Cry 3 introducing Voss, one of the greatest villains of all time, well, let's just say I was a little disappointed with what we got in Far Cry 5. While trying to avoid spoilers here, I'll just say that the characters used a lot of flawed, narrow-minded logic that they really try to hammer into you with lengthy, dialogue-heavy cutscenes, and it all ends in a really unsatisfying way. There are even multiple endings to the game, and yet none of them are satisfying in any way. Thankfully though, they did already announce their DLC plans for the game, and considering what's in this game's DLC future, it's safe to say they didn't do this bad ending to sell more DLC. At least I'm fairly certain this game's not going to continue its story in a cheesy zombie horror movie, on Mars, or in Vietnam. And next, I find this game's setting to be the weakest in the Far Cry franchise. I mean, it's possible because I live in America, it's sort of biased, since a lot of the sights you'll see in game are something that's going to be really familiar as an American. But to me, it just seems kind of dry and bland compared to the previous games where we're on a tropical island or out in the Himalayas. And where do we go in Far Cry 5? We're going to Montana. I guess it's a good thing that the DLCs are going to be completely non-canon and taking place in their own universes, because I think I'm already prepared for a change of scenery. Now that we're done talking about the setting, let's talk about the settings. I'll try and keep this part brief since it's kind of boring, but let's just say this game did not get a great PC port. Don't get me wrong, I've seen much worse ports than this, but for a PC game the settings are incredibly lacking. Like for example, not having separate audio sliders for ambience, sound effects, music, and voices, or being able to remove some annoying effects like depth of field. Far Cry 5 was clearly developed with consoles in mind first and PC second. And never is this more apparent than when you need a fucking flashlight. I will spare you the rant, since I know you've probably heard it on my channel 1,000 times before. But the next game that does not give me control of my own goddamn flashlight, I can't be held responsible for what I'm gonna do to it. There's also no way to communicate through text while playing multiplayer, so that's also an issue that arises out of the whole consoles before PC approach to game development. They make a game for console, they communicate through microphones, and then you make the game ported over to PC, and they forget that players on PC mostly communicate with text. You know, because we have keyboards. I would never go as far as to say it's an obvious oversight for a PC port, and with all the problems inherent to this game's bias towards consoles out of the way, we're still not done. The variety of weapon choices in this game is severely lacking. Each category appears to have plenty of variety, but in reality only really has 2 or 3 different weapons, with a ton of pointless variations of each. There's 4 different revolvers in this game, and they're all the same revolver with different barrels. There's 2 variations of the basic shotgun in the game, one without a stock and one with a sawed-off barrel. 4 different variations of an AK-47. One of the sniper rifles is just the basic assault rifle given a longer barrel, and for some reason there are 2 different bows in the game that behave almost exactly the same way. They waste weapon slots that they could have used on other cooler weapons. We could have had more fully automatic assault rifles, but instead there's 2 variations that perform exactly the same way, by the way, of of the basic ARC assault rifle, 4 different AKs, again, perform exactly the same, 2 different versions of the semi-automatic M14, and 2 different versions of the lever-action Winchester, because we totally needed a modern tactical-looking version of the Winchester repeater instead of, you know, actual different weapons. I feel like even Far Cry 3 had more variety to its weapons than this. It's really kinda disappointing. And lastly, there's unfortunately no kind of save slots or even a New Game Plus feature, which is annoying for 2 reasons. 1, the perks you unlock in the campaign carry over into the arcade mode, and starting a new game resets all that. And 2, completing every single mission and every single outpost in the game only took me about 37 hours to 100% complete the game. Now granted, this game has a lot of tools for you to just fuck around with your friends, and there's a lot of room for you to get sidetracked doing that when you do play co-op. Not to mention the game's arcade mode, which is literally limitless as long as people still play the game at all. It's still kind of a meager playtime for an open world single player focused game. I'm still gonna hold it against the game even though I enjoyed that 37 hours. The first thing I want to mention here is 4-player co-op. As it stands, the game only allows co-op modes to be played with 2 players. And no con, co-op does not mean 2 players. 4-player co-op is a thing and you're wrong. And I mean, currently you're allowed to have another player in your game as well as a follower NPC. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to allow 2 more players to join the game, but make it so you can't summon any followers if you have at least 3 people in your game. And I mean, 2-player co-op is fine if you only have one buddy you want to play with, but when you have a group of friends all getting the same game and playing it at the same time, it's kind of annoying that you have to split up into groups of 2 or pick favorites with who you want to play with. Next, I also would have loved the ability to filter out map markers on your main map. As it stands, every map marker is always visible no matter what, and their answer to prevent clutter is to make it so minor map markers disappear when you zoom out too far, which leads to situations where you're trying to find one certain minor map marker, and you have to spend an hour hovering around the map looking for that one little marker that you know has got to be around here somewhere, all without being able to zoom out because the marker will disappear if you do. And lastly, after going back and looking at some of the little details added to Far Cry 2, I have to ask, just what the fuck happened? Far Cry 2 just had so many little nuances to the physics engine, the UI, and the gameplay mechanics, which in hindsight seem to have been slowly taken away from the franchise. Things like bullet penetration, for example, spreading fire that will actually burn the leaves off of trees instead of just turn them black, rocket launchers that were actually a fire hazard with the exhaust, advanced AI that would run to their teammates when wounded or try to make a last stand, hide behind a rock, being able to shoot leaves and branches off of trees and bushes, the gruesome and varied healing animations for when you get injured too badly, and having those be the actual mechanic for getting your health back rather than just sitting in cover and waiting. Or the awesome map from Far Cry 2 where it's actually a map that you pull out and hold in your hands. Weapon decay with jams and malfunctions the more you use them. All of this shit just gone. What the fuck happened? I would have loved to see these mechanics make a return in Far Cry 5. Since they haven't though, hopefully it'll appear in Far Cry 6 if that happens. And so coming to the final verdict for Far Cry 5, it's gonna have to come out to an 8 out of 10. Far Cry 5 so far joins the legion of games I've reviewed that got this score of pretty damn good, but not quite amazing or perfect. Someday it could turn out to be a 9 out of 10 just because of all the user-made content that can come later on, courtesy of that new arcade mode, but as it currently stands with the current selection from the user arcade, it's just gonna come out to an 8. But you know what? For all its flaws, I actually really enjoy this game. It's one that I would highly recommend, especially if you have friends to play it with. And it's one of the first games in a long time that I've actually gotten excited for the season pass. So you might see me streaming that later or something, but until then, that's the end of this video. Go ahead and do the YouTube buttons or the Twitch buttons if you like the video, or support me on Patreon if you'd like, and until next time, I'll see you later. Hiya! 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 I got pipes for days, come at me. I'm coming to pipe you. You ready to get piped? Hey.
Do you see it?
Pipe down.
The transformative power of faith. The poor souls who struggle with doubt.